Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this webinar about the Frontline Employee Program. I'm Mike Pichak. I'm the Commissioner at the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation, and our department, in consultation with the Agency of Human Services, will be administering the second round of hazard pay grants. We wanted to get this webinar on the books prior to the applications opening up, because I know there are a lot of questions about some of the details, and we're going to run through about a 15-minute presentation on some of those high-level details that I'm sure you have questions about. But then we've reserved a lot of time toward the end of the webinar for you all to be able to ask questions and make sure that we answer those, and then we'll also provide an opportunity to reach out to us after this webinar to follow up with any additional questions that you might have. But really want to have this as an opportunity to get information, to learn more about the program. And I also want to just plug, again, there's about a day and a half here until the program opens up on Wednesday morning. I would encourage employers who are interested in applying on behalf of their employees to really get well versed with the program details, to get those employee lists together between now and Wednesday morning, so that you're in a position to apply early on Wednesday morning. It's a first come, first serve program. We don't know for sure how many applicants we'll get, but we know there's going to be significant interest. So we do encourage people to apply early and make sure that they have all the information they need to do so in advance of Wednesday morning. And the last broad point I would make, just for everyone's awareness, is that the money that's being used to fund the hazard pay program is out of the CARES Act, and there is a requirement in the CARES Act, which was a federal legislation, that money be spent by states by December 30th of this year. So we are under a tight timeline. That's why we are trying to work as expeditiously as possible, while also making sure we get information out to employers and make sure that you have a efficient and well-run process for applying for these grants. So that's an important point of context that I want to make sure everybody has as well. I'm joined today by three really capable people on our team. Jill Rickard, who's our Director of Policy at the department, will run through an overview of the program for about 15 minutes. And then she's joined by Ethan McLaughlin, who's an Associate General Counsel at our department, and Wendy Trafton, who's at the Agency of Human Services, who ran the first round of the hazard pay grant program. So combined, they'll be able to answer your questions after Jill runs through her presentation. I know they will do a really good job of getting you the information that you need. So without any further ado, why don't I turn it over to Jill Rickard.
Thank you, Commissioner Pichak. This webinar, like Commissioner Pichak said, is being presented by the Department of Financial Regulation and the Agency of Human Services. My name is Jill Rickard, and I'll be providing an overview of the program, its eligibility requirements, and application procedures. At any point during or after the presentation, you'll be able to ask a question using the chat function on your screen. It's actually called the live event Q&A. After the presentation, my colleagues and I will try to answer as many of those questions as possible during the time we've allotted. If your question is not answered, or if you have additional questions after this webinar, please email covidhazardpay@vermont.gov. And again, I'll give you that email address several times within this presentation, and including at the end. So this webinar is for informational purposes only and is intended to summarize the Frontline Employees Hazard Pay Grant Program guidance documents. For full program guidance, frequently asked questions, and application documents, please visit the program website at the address shown on your screen. You may also Google Frontline Employees Hazard Pay Grant Program in Vermont, and it should be the first result. Next slide, please. The Frontline Employees Hazard Pay Grant Program was created by the Vermont Legislature in Act 136 of 2020. $28 million was allocated for round one of the program, which has been completed. Round one of the program provided hazard pay grants to certain public safety, public health, healthcare, and human services employers whose employees were engaged in activities substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 public health emergency during the covered period, which is March 13th to May 15th of this year. The program has since been expanded by Acts 154 and 168 of 2020 to include additional types of employers who are not public safety, public health, healthcare, or human services employers, but whose employees were providing certain essential services to Vermonters during the covered period. An additional $22.5 million has been allocated to round 2 of the program. Funding for this program, as Commissioner Piczek mentioned, was made available to the state through the Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund, or CRF. Next slide, please. First of all, only employers may apply for a hazard pay grant on behalf of their employees. Individual employees are not permitted to apply. The exception to this rule is for former employees that are eligible but no longer employed at the time the employer submits an application. I will talk about this special situation in a later slide. The law specifies 26 categories of covered employer that may receive hazard pay for their employees. Federal, state, and municipal employers, such as public schools, and designated agencies and specialized services agencies are not eligible to apply. These types of employers may have been eligible for CRF funds through other program grants. In addition to the public safety, public health, healthcare, and human services employers included in round 1, approximately 14 new covered employer types have been added in round 2. These include traveling nurse agencies, cleaning and janitorial services, and food service providers that provided services to certain types of healthcare facilities, grocery stores, pharmacies, hardware stores, and retailers serving basic human needs, such as those that sell food, beverage, animal feed, and essential supplies, wholesale distributors, trash collection, waste management, and septic services, and privately owned water pollution abatement and control facilities, child care facilities that provided child care services to essential service providers pursuant to Governor Scott's executive order, vocational rehab service providers, funeral and crematory establishments, and security services agencies. Also in round 2, the category of homeless shelter covered employer has been expanded to include hotels and motels that provided temporary housing to homeless individuals pursuant to an agreement with the Department for Children and Families. And we also interpret the category a provider of necessities and services to vulnerable and disadvantaged populations more expansively than in round 1. It may now include certain employers that are not within the public safety, public health, healthcare, and human services buckets. This is not an exhaustive list of covered employers, and there may be additional qualifying criteria attached to some of these employer categories. I'm going to pause for a minute because some people are saying they can't hear. Just make sure that your speakers are unmuted. I think if you can hear, post in the Q&A, please, and just confirm.
Still, the person who couldn't hear said that they were able to figure it out.
Okay, thank you. So again, this is what I just read was not an exhaustive list of covered employers, and there may be additional qualifying criteria attached to some of these employer categories. Please see the program guidance for a full list of covered employer types. Next slide, please, Nick. If an employer falls into one of the categories of covered employer, then they can apply for funding for their eligible employees. To be eligible, an employee must have worked at least 68 hours during the eligible period of March 13th to May 15th, 2020. They must have performed a job that had an elevated risk of exposure to COVID-19, and I'll define this in a moment. They must have been unable to perform their job remotely or to telework, and they must have earned a base wage of $25 or less per hour, with exceptions for certain healthcare employees. An employee who received unemployment insurance benefits for more than 1 week during the eligible period is not eligible to receive a hazard pay grant. An employee who received a grant of hazard pay in round 1 of the program is not eligible for additional funding in round 2. So elevated risk of exposure to COVID-19 means the performance of a job that meets one of the following criteria. It has high potential for exposure to known or suspected sources of COVID-19, either by providing in-person services or care, or regularly cleaning or sanitizing the premises of a covered employer. It requires frequent physical or close contact within 6 feet of individuals who may be infected with COVID-19, but are not known or suspected COVID patients, or involves regularly cleaning or sanitizing the premises of a covered employee in a location that's used by individuals who may be infected with COVID-19, such as the public, but are not known or suspected COVID patients, or is located in an area or facility with ongoing community transmission of COVID-19. Next slide. Eligible former employees are employees that satisfy the eligibility criteria, but no longer work for a covered employer at the time the employer submits an application to the program. Amendments to the program legislation since round 1 make former employees eligible, and an employer must apply on behalf of all potentially eligible current and former employees. In the case of employers that applied for and received hazard pay funding in round 1, they should reapply on behalf of potentially eligible former employees. These employers should have been contacted or should be contacted by email today at the email address they provided in their round 1 application. Employers applying for the first time in round 2 should include former employees in their hazard pay funding application. Since former employees are no longer on an employer's payroll, if an employer's application is approved, the employer will not receive funding for their former employees. The former employees will be instructed by the grant review team to apply separately for a grant to be paid directly from the program. So once an employer's application is approved, we will contact the former employees to provide them with an application and instructions for submission. Next slide. Covered employers can receive either $1,200 or $2,000 in hazard pay for each eligible employee. The grant amount depends on the number of hours the employee worked during the eligible period. Eligible employees who worked at least 216 hours in a job with elevated risk of exposure to COVID-19 during the eligible period will receive $2,000 in hazard pay. This is before payroll taxes. And eligible employees who worked between 68 and 216 hours during the eligible period will receive $1,200 in hazard pay, again, before payroll taxes. Hours worked as an independent contractor or sole proprietor are not eligible. If an eligible employee received unemployment insurance benefits, but for a period of 1 week or less during the eligible period, they can receive $1,200 only, regardless of the number of hours worked. Next slide, please. The interplay between hazard pay and public benefits is nuanced. We encourage all employees to review the frequently asked questions about public benefits on the program website. I'll include that website address again at the end of this presentation. In case of additional questions after reviewing those FAQ, employees can call the healthcare advocate with questions about healthcare benefits, including Vermont Medicaid, call Vermont Legal Aid about other public benefits, or visit www.vtlawhelp.org. An employee also has the right to refuse hazard pay. If this happens, their employer will have to return their portion of hazard pay to the state. Next slide, please, Nick. Employers who receive a grant will distribute hazard pay to current employees through payroll. If possible, employers should also disperse hazard pay to recently terminated employees. These are employees who terminated employment between the time of the employer's application and the employer's receipt of hazard pay grant funds. If it is not possible to distribute hazard pay to a recently terminated employee, the employer should contact the grant review team for assistance. Hazard pay is taxable. Employers may deduct both the employees and the employer's share of payroll taxes from hazard pay. Unemployment taxes are only deductible to the extent they directly arise from the payment of hazard pay. Vermont unemployment tax is payable on the first $16,100 of wages during a calendar year, and federal unemployment tax is payable on the first $7,000 of wages during a calendar year. If the hazard pay payment made to an employee is not part of the first $16,100 paid to the employee in 2020, then no state or federal unemployment tax may be deducted. Again, this part is nuanced, and we encourage employers to review the full program guidance and FAQ, and to email the grant review team at covidhazardpay@vermont.gov with questions specific to their circumstances. Next slide. The application portal opens on Wednesday, October 28th at 9 a.m. Applications will be processed on a first-come, first-served basis. To expedite the application process, we encourage employers to complete the summary report of eligible employees and the summary report of former employees in advance of applying. These reports are the most time-consuming part of the application. Plan to have them completed and ready to go before you apply. Employers must provide information about eligible employees' receipt of unemployment benefits during the eligible period. They will need to certify on the application whether each employee received up to 1 week or more than 1 week of unemployment benefits. If an employer is unsure, we suggest the following. If the employer did not lay off or reduce the hours of a particular employee during the eligible period, then they may answer that the employee did not receive unemployment benefits. However, if they did lay off or reduce an employee's hours during the eligible period, the employer will need to ask the employee if they received unemployment benefits and for what duration. Because of the tight time frame, we understand that it may be difficult for some employers to contact all their employees prior to applying. If they are unable to communicate with a particular employee about the receipt of unemployment benefits, they may indicate on their application that the employee received a week or less of unemployment. In the summary report, they will indicate that the employee received unemployment, but that the number of weeks will be verified post-application. If an employer is approved for a grant, they will then have to confirm the employee's eligibility before paying out their portion of the hazard pay and provide confirmation in a final report to the state before December 15th. Again, if you have questions about this part, please email covidhazardpay@vermont.gov. And in case of questions, again, the program website has information about full program requirements, eligibility, it has application documents and frequently asked questions. And that is at the link here, or again, just Google Vermont Frontline Employees Hazard Pay Grant Program. And again, the email address here, covidhazardpay@vermont.gov, will get you a response from a member of the Hazard Pay Grant Review or administrative team. Thank you for your attention. We will now answer questions that have been posed in the chat function.
Hi, this is Ethan McLaughlin. I'm Associate General Counsel with the Department of Financial Regulation, and I'm going to go through some of the questions that we've received in the chat together with my colleague from AHS, Wendy Trafton. Before I do, there's just one helpful thing that I want to add, which is that after you apply, be sure to check your spam folder for responses with respect to your grant application. All the responses saying that your application has been accepted, or if there's incomplete information you need to do more, will come via an automated email address. The experience with some of the other grant programs is that some spam filters will catch that and put it into the junk mail folder. So there are notices saying to check your spam folder, but we can't say that enough. So the first question that I'm going to take on is someone's asking for guidance on how to determine if employees received unemployment benefits during the covered period. So employers need to use the information that's available to them. We understand that so employers will know whether or not they they laid off employees or not, or reduced hours in a way that would have created eligibility for unemployment. You can also look at your the monthly reports you have received from the Department of Labor regarding unemployment benefit use. We do ask specific questions about the number of weeks of unemployment benefits that were received during the eligible period, which is March 13th through May 15th. In that case, we understand that you might not be able to discern that from the Department of Labor reports, and in that case, employers should ask their employees, whether they received 1 week or less of benefits, or more than 1 week of benefits during the eligible period. Because we know that not all that could be a time-intensive process, and you might not hear back from an employee before you need to apply. The spreadsheet of the summary report of current eligible employees that you need to fill in, one of the choices there is to say, yes, the employee received unemployment benefits and the number of weeks will be confirmed prior to payment. If you check that option for any employee, it'll be incumbent upon you as the employer to verify with that employee that, how much unemployment they received before making a payment to them with a grant award. And there'll be some reporting on that in the final report, which is due on or before December 15th. So that's the first question. Wendy?
Hi, yes. We received a question from an applicant from round one asking how they would reapply. We wanted to indicate that you should be using the same account that you used in round one. So you'd want to be logging in under that same username. If you have any trouble locating your password, you can ask to receive a new password from this registration site. And do remember it ends with .vtgrants. So we will need you to reapply, and that's how we'll connect the two applications. And you will be, you're only allowed to submit one application per parent company, which is identified by the FEIN number. So that's another important reason why you'll want to use your same username. Sending it back to Ethan for the next question.
There were several questions from employees asking how they apply for a grant. And employees are not eligible to apply for grants directly. The employer needs to apply for the grant on its employee's behalf, and the payments are made through payroll after deductions for various payroll taxes. Now, for former employees, it's also the case that the employer needs to apply on behalf of a employee that was eligible but is no longer employed by the employer at the time of application. In that case, the employer is going to provide contact information for each of its former employees, and the grant review team will in turn reach out to each of those employees if the employer's grant application is approved, and invite those former employees to then apply directly, and they'll be sent an application that they will send back to the state. But that's only in the case of former employees who have been identified by their employer in an application and had that application approved. But if you are a former employee or an employee of an employer that you believe may be eligible, you may want to reach out to your employer just to make sure that they're aware of the grant program. And especially in the case of former employees, make sure that your former employer has updated contact information for you. Okay, Wendy?
Great. We received a question about the sort of tax taxes related to former employees. One individual asked if the state would be issuing a 1099 for the grant income or if it should somehow be included in W-2s. The answer to that question is yes, the state will be both dispersing hazard pay to the former employees who submit the application back, and will also be issuing a 1099 for those taxes. Ethan?
Yep. So there's a question asking if there were new dates that can be applied for, or if we've just expanded what employer types can apply. The dates are the same as in round one. The primary expansion is in the employer types, but there have also been expansions in the in some of the other definitions, such that some employees that weren't eligible in round one may be eligible now in some limited circumstances, which Jill touched
on. We received a question about the timeline. We are beginning to receive applications as early as Wednesday, October 28th at 9 a.m. And at that point, we are accepting applications through November 13th or until funds are allocated. Someone has also asked about when those applicants will be notified they're approved and awards will be funded. We are hoping to begin reviewing applications as early as the day they're received, but you know, we will be doing it as quickly as possible. But do want to note we intend to get funding back out to those awarded applicants by November 24th in order to allow those applicants to disperse funding and return any unused funds by December 15th. Ethan?
Okay, so there were also some questions from employers that had some of their operations fall within a definition of a covered employer type, and perhaps others of their operations did not. In that situation, only the employees that worked in the operation that's a covered employer type would be eligible, and then only if those employees, you know, meet the hour thresholds for working in a job with a high risk of exposure to COVID-19, as that's defined in the program guidance. For example, a college may not be generally eligible as an employer type, but a college with a medical clinic, that medical clinic, you know, would be an eligible employer type. So employees are working in that capacity with an elevated risk of exposure to COVID-19 could be applied on behalf of. Wendy?
Great. We are getting questions from some of the round one applicants. We are requesting that all round one applicants who received an award to reapply for their former employees. Some questions about that process have been asked as well. If round one applicants are only submitting lists or a summary report of former employees through their reapplication, that will result in the state of Vermont sending a letter and application form to those former employees. It does not require the awardee, the covered employer from round one, to do any additional activities to disperse those funds. But we really do need your support in helping us know who those former employees are who do meet the eligibility criteria